The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines a quilt as a bed coverlet of 2 layers of cloth filled with padding, such as batting or down, held in place by ties or stitched designs. But that very basic definition does not tell us the full story of quilts, nor does it remind us of the stories that some quilts can tell us. There are many kinds of quilts. There are simple patchwork quilts, crazy quilts, album quilts, pieced quilts, appliqué quilts, patriotic quilts, and many more. They all tend to have one thing in common. They're made from fabric remnants or pieces of cloth salvaged from worn-out clothing. What makes each quilt unique is the way that the pieces are stitched together to form intricately colored patterns with such fanciful names as birds in air, ocean waves, log cabin, tumbling blocks, Irish chain, feathered star, or snail's trail, just to name only a few. The Museum of Chincoteague Island has some excellent examples of commemorative signature quilts and quilts that memorialize different eras in the history of Chincoteague Island. These quilts are reminders of simpler times when traditions and community were anchored by family and friends. Signature quilts were made for various reasons. Friendship quilts were made for special occasions such as a wedding or the birth of a child. Presentation quilts were made to honor an individual, such as a quilt made for a retiring pastor with the names of all the parishioners. Fundraising quilts were made to raise funds for a specific cause. Individuals would pay a fee to have their names included on the quilt. And that brings us to our first quilt, the Fire Company quilt. This quilt is an excellent example of a fundraising quilt. Made in 1918, this embroidered wool quilt was made to raise money for the fledgling Chincoteague Volunteer Fire Company by the wives of the Island Bucket Brigade. For 10 cents, you could have your name embroidered on the quilt. There are 780 names on this example, many of them with surnames still prominent on the island today. There is an especially charming aspect here. Each individual panel on the quilt was sewn by a different woman. The names were probably traced lightly in pencil on the fabric and embroidered. If you look carefully, you will see a wide range of penmanship, sewing skills, reversed letters, awkward spacing, and imaginative spelling of many of the names. These features add a desired, naive quality to the quilt that is prized by knowledgeable quilt collectors of American folk art. Some women paid a little extra to acquire silk thread for the embroidery. Unfortunately, the silk has not held up as well as the good old cheaper cotton thread. When completed, the quilt was exhibited and raffled off at Derrickson's store and won by Cortland Bloxam. It was donated to the museum by Mrs. Margaret Bloxam. Next, we have an example of a log cabin quilt. This quilt was an anonymous donation to the Chincoteague United Methodist Church Opportunity Shop. Shop volunteers Hazel Wessels and Nancy Conklin thoughtfully notified the Museum of Chincoteague Island and arranged for its acquisition. It is made from cotton and silk fabrics. The silks are showing signs of deterioration. Individual log cabin quilt squares of lights and darks can be arranged in many different geometric variations to form a quilt design. The pieces in this quilt are arranged in a variation of the log cabin pattern called barn raising. The quilt is embroidered with initials and the year 1895. Its provenance is largely unknown since it was an anonymous donation to the Opportunity Shop. However, if anyone can match the sets of initials to people living on Chincoteague at the time, its provenance can be more firmly established. Next, we have the Pointer Quilt. The Pointer Quilt reminds us of World War II, its aftermath, and its impact on the island. David and Lily Pointer ran a laundry and tailor shop at the corner of Main and Cleveland Streets, where there is now a small park. In the 1940s, Lily Pointer did military uniform alterations and tailoring for many of the servicemen stationed at the Navy base at Wallops Island, at the Army's Camp Fletcher on Church Street, and the Coast Guard station. She saved the pieces of the uniforms and used whatever thread she had available to begin to make a quilt. Look closely and you can still see on some of the fabric pieces the old laundry marks and the stenciled names of the men who wore the uniforms. Look even more closely and you'll find the tiny embroidered holes where the name tags and badges were pinned. The quilt is signed and dated at the top but was never fully completed. The museum acquired the Pointer quilt as a gift from Sandra Palmer Goff, the Pointer's granddaughter. Next we have the Centennial Quilt. In the tradition of quilts from an earlier time, the museum led an effort over 10 years ago to produce a fundraising quilt in commemoration of the centennial anniversary of the incorporation of the town of Chincoteague. The project, coordinated by Ruth Williams, involved the quilting skills of the women of the Ladies' Aid Society at the Union Baptist Church and professional embroidery skills of Patty Savage. People paid $10 each to have their names memorialized on the quilt, and the money was donated to the Museum of Chincoteague Island. Many of the people who participated are descendants of those whose names appear on the 1918 Fire Company quilt. The family surnames are the same. Some of the quilt blocks highlight Chincoteague landmarks and symbols. Finally, we have the Hancock Quilt. Bertha Hancock, the wife of noted decoy carver Miles Hancock, was a quilter. Bertha's quilts sometimes competed for his customers' attention when his workshop was open for business. This applique quilt was one of them. An applique quilt is one where the individual fabric pieces are sewn or applied to a base fabric to complete the overall design. In the 1930s and 1940s, newspapers and magazines printed quilting patterns and directions as filler from time to time. This pattern, called Daisy Applique, was one of them. Helen Hancock Gaskins, daughter of Miles and Bertha, donated this quilt to the museum.